Nigel Farage has said it's the end of two-party politics and that the Conservatives in particular are dead.
Mel Stride's just been in to visit us to have a cup of tea and talk about Nigel Farage's fantasy economics and why the Conservatives still have 200 more years in them.
Now, the critical thing for him, and he has stood up today amongst other things and said, oh, the mainstream parties, they're finished. Quite an arrogant thing to say 4.5 years from an election. But what he's got to do is he's got to keep this juggling act, keep convincing everybody that he can be all things to all men and women, and he can have all these giveaways in this Corbynite McDonald kind of fashion that he goes at it with, and keep that up for 4.5 years. So I don't think he should be standing up saying he's a shoo-in for number 10.
Mel Stride joins us. Mel, Shadow Chancellor, welcome to the Daily Tea again. A regular
Lovely
visitor.
To be here.
We love having you here. Bumped into you on the tube on the way over. You were making some comments about the Daily Tea, but you stopped when Cleo and I walked into the same tube.
I was winding you up. I think I said something like, the worst podcast going is the Daily Tea, and there you were.
Bumped into you on the tube on the short ride from Westminster to Victoria. But Mel Stride, thank you so much for coming in to discuss Nigel Farage and his new super policy announcements. Just give us your view on the numbers. He was questioned by quite a few of the journalists that wasn't he just another politician setting out lots of benefit increases for people and tax incentives for people, but how is he going to pay for it? Have you been through any of the numbers, and what's your take?
So there's a smattering of things going on, wasn't there? Something for everybody in there. So I think it's fantasy economics. So if you look at the tax stuff, he's announced today that he's going to reverse or get rid of the two-child benefit and reinstate the non-means testing of the winter fuel payments, about £5 billion. In the manifesto, they had about £140 billion of giveaways, tax and spending. And within that, there was a commitment which he repeated today to take everybody earning up to £20,000 a year out of income tax altogether. That is a £60 billion a year commitment. That is eye-watering, okay? Now, on the how do you raise the money question, what he mentioned was £7 billion a year out of DEI, so getting rid of the diversity and equality and all of that stuff. That £7 billion, I think, is roughly what we raise through inheritance tax every year. It's a very large amount of money, and let's see what his arguments are. Maybe there is £7 billion worth of this floating around. On savings from Quangos, this is the one that interested me the most. He suggested £65 billion in savings over 5 years. That is £12 billion a year, and he said it was 5% of the Quango budget. So if you multiply it up to get the amount that we're apparently spending on Quangos, that's £240 billion a year on Quangos. That's £250 billion. How does that work? I don't know. Is he including NHS England within that as a Quango? Well, that's the health budget, so there's 5% coming off that, presumably. But with no detail and no plan as to how he would still make sure we had a good, efficient, well-run health service as a consequence. He mentioned in the manifesto, I think it was 5% on government spending, so that yields £50 billion a year because it's being applied to about £1 trillion a year. But that, of course, would include not only the health service, but include pensions, which are transfer payments to our pensioners, which is well over 10, 12% or thereabouts of government spending. So is he saying that pensioners are going to see their pensions cut by 5%? We just don't have enough detail. And none of these numbers feel real and realistic to me at all. And I think that's quite dangerous.
Aren't there two big things, though, that the public hear? Immigration, he's exactly in the right place and absolutely consistent in a way the Conservative Party has simply not been. And the second is that he supports the family, and he supports families having children, and he supports marriage. Both those things, a lot of the voters think the Conservatives completely failed on.
So when he says he supports families having children, what he's referring to there is the policies come forward today on the two-child benefit cap. And I think he's in the wrong place on that, because I think there are 2 points to this. One is the cost of it. So that is £3.7 billion a year. And you can add that into all the other tens of billions he's saying he's splashing around in a Corbynite manner, incidentally. And the second thing, a point of fairness, that if you're out there working and you're not on benefits, you have sometimes a very tough decision to make as to whether you can afford to have a large family rather than, say, a family of one or two children. And I think most people would think it was fair that those on benefits should not just simply have other taxpayers paying for their children, whatever the number of children they have.
We were quite struck today when we were looking at the sort of sequencing and formatting of the event that he had two women on the stage at last, Sarah Pochin and Andrea Jenkins.
Yeah.
Andrea Jenkins, a former colleague of yours in particular, nodding along. Why do you think that he is making this play? He talks about working families and how these are policies for men and women, but according to the polls that we see already, the majority of particularly young people are men who are voting for him. Why do you think he is making this play perhaps towards women and some of those sort of small c conservative social values that traditionally women would have held and were something that a Conservative Party in particular could go after?
Well, look, I think the family really matters, and as a Conservative Party, we believe the family really matters, and as part of our renewal programme, we're going to look at all of these kind of issues around how we strengthen families and communities and thereby the country. So none of that's, there's nothing wrong. But to your question, what I see is somebody who's scouting around, eyeing a particular audience, working out in a very populist manner what tunes play best to that audience, and then striking up the orchestra. Okay, that's what he does. So you've got somebody on the one hand talks about low taxes and government efficiencies and things, appealing to the right, and then on the other turn you've got rather these big state interventionist tendencies that he has, for example, including the removal of the two-child benefit and an approach to trade unions and so on that one would more associate with the left. Now, the critical thing for him, and he has stood up today amongst other things and said, the mainstream parties, they're finished. Quite an arrogant thing to say 4.5 years from an election. But what he's got to do is he's got to keep this juggling act, keep convincing everybody that he can be all things to all men and women, and he can have all these giveaways in this Corbynite McDonald kind of fashion that he goes at it with, and keep that up for 4.5 years. So I don't think he should be standing up saying he's a shoo-in for number 10.
Isn't this ending of left and right? You're saying it's a juggling act and he's picking from either side where it suits what you describe as his populist narrative. I maybe just describe it as popular rather than maybe populist. But isn't that smart politics, given that he says that Labour and you are actually now a uni party trying to offer the same solutions for the failed policies that you've been involved in the past? So actually, he's a very new type of politician. I suppose the frustration for voters, and maybe for those of us who comment on politics and analyse politics, is that he's actually gaining momentum because he realises the old left-right doesn't work anymore. And just like Donald Trump in America and J.D. Vance, people reach over into workers' rights. They reach over into nationalisation. They do things that are different from you. And that's the point, that the Conservatives are the same offer again that they gave us and failed on.
So whether it's smart politics or not, we'll be able to judge in about 4 years' time. Does he walk through the doors of number 10 Downing Street, or has he faded away? And let's not forget how volatile politics is. Pierre Poilievre in Canada, you would have said, was a shoo-in some months before that general election, 23 points ahead in the polls. And not only did he lose, he lost his own seat. Albanese in Australia. Look at the Labour Party in 2019 has the worst result since the 2030s. Since the 1930s, and yet then he's back within 5 short years with a landslide. That's the kind of environment that we're in. As to what we're offering, we are working on what we're offering. We have recognised that we have an economy that is not fit for purpose. It is not growing strongly enough. It has productivity issues. It needs to get back to at least the trend growth we had before the great financial crash, and more, if it is to meet the huge challenges that we have nationally in terms of the geopolitical shifts around America and defence and Europe and trade wars and all of those kind of things. If we're going to meet the additional burdens of an ageing population back at home, if as a party we're going to address intergenerational fairness such that we get away from having 63 as the average age of a Tory voter in the last election. So we're going to have to fundamentally rewire the economy, and we've got 4 years to work out how we do that. Now, we've got the problem of Farage, of course, in the meantime, and there are things that we need to do in that space, some of which is around the economy and providing better scrutiny of Nigel Farage. But I don't think anybody should think that the Tory party is just going to now be a continuum of what it was before. It's going to be coming up with some very radically difficult policies, different policies. But the difference with Farage will be that we will have done the thinking and the numbers will add up.
I mean, that's obviously his claim, which is why he's sort of delivering these policy announcements in, I would say, conveniently in sort of piecemeal format, so that everyone can take it and digest it and he can decide what he does next. Don't you think that the Conservatives need to get a move on with some of these announcements, though? Because in the meantime, a vacuum is being created and he's able to fill it. I mean, the room was absolutely packed today with the nation's media on, quite cleverly picked a week during recess where nothing else is going on in politics. He's had, apart from everything going on with Liverpool, he's basically had the agenda to himself. And apart from being able to say, well, we're working on it, we're going to have a very comprehensive plan, don't you think you need to have that really quite soon? Because 4 years is actually quite a short time in politics.
Let's look at the approach he's taken. So what he did today was he stood up and said, here are a load of goodies, right? And I'll give you a vague idea how they're going to be paid for. And he also said something else. He said, I'll come back in a year's time and we'll talk through how this all works and how the money all stacks up. I think we've got to expose that for what it is, which is going out there and making lots of promises without a plan, without having thought it through and saying, oh, I'll come back later and tell you about that. I'm not sure that's going to withstand scrutiny. As to your point about us, you're absolutely right. We have got to do longer term thinking, which will take time. But that doesn't mean that in the meantime, firstly, we can't hold this government ruthlessly to account, which is what the British electorate put us in Parliament to do, and I believe we are doing. For example, the U-turn on winter fuel payments, I think, is an example of the work that we've been doing. Secondly, we've got to talk probably more about our values, not all the specific policies, but we can talk about general direction where we're going. I will be giving a speech on the economy relatively soon, in which some of that sort of rough-hewn shape of the pot will be revealed, if not the final item. And I think the other thing is, yes, there will be some policies that we can come forward with along the way because it's appropriate and responsible to do that. But don't underestimate the challenge of cutting through for the Conservative Party that has lost the trust of the electorate and is not getting a hearing at the moment. We have said things about policy. We will reverse the VAT tax on schools. We will reverse business property relief changes, agricultural property relief changes. We are saying we will not stick to the 2050 net zero targets. We've said on immigration we will disapply the Human Rights Act when it comes to deporting people. We have said that we will double the period of time somebody coming to our shores has to be here before they can get indefinite leave to remain. These are big policy things to say, but it's still seen as where we are in the polls. So there is no magic lever on the policy side at the moment that is suddenly going to transform our position.
Now, you said that you're pro-family, the Conservatives are pro-family, then presumably you do support lifting the 2-child cap on children's benefits and reintroducing the transferable tax allowance between married couples.
No, we don't agree with the 2-child
but I'm saying if you're
yeah.
pro-family, wouldn't the voters say, well, you should agree with both of those policies because they support families? If you support families, why are you against these policies?
Well, for the reasons I explained in terms of the 2-child benefit cap, that is there because firstly it's extremely expensive to remove it, and secondly I think there is an issue of fairness as between those that aren't on benefits and have to take those tough decisions about whether they can afford to have a large family or not, and those that are on benefits. So I think there has to be a balance struck. But of course we are pro-family. We always have
transferable
been.
Tax allowance.
Yeah, possibly. But
so we will look at that.
What we certainly won't do is bob up at a press conference and say we're doing that along with a whole bunch of other things without a very clear plan as to how it's going to be paid for and how it's all going to work.
But Mel, is that not the crux of your problem? I suppose is that Nigel Farage is relatively untested. He doesn't have a record he has to defend yet. He showed up with all his councillors and his 2 mayors today, and given time, they will have a record they'll have to defend. But the problem, it seems to me, for you and your party leader and the rest of the shadow cabinet, and indeed the rest of the Conservative Party, is defending a record that, for whatever reason, voters aren't happy with. And so, some of those big ticket policy ideas you were just outlining, are strong and big things, but they're not new territory. They're not kind of new ideas to get people thinking. And actually, there was a sense with some of what Nigel Farage was saying today is that he is thinking about things differently, and it's quite hard to fight someone who's able to be, in sort of guerrilla warfare style of politics, and to, even though you're in opposition, to look establishment.
I think there will be a growing market for responsible politics going forward. We're going through an era of populism. We're seeing what's happening in America, and America is potentially having some looming economic problems that could affect all of us. We've got a populist in Nigel Farage who today has said, you're saying new things. Well, the new thing he's saying is actually that, rather like Corbyn, he's quite prepared to go out and spray inordinate amounts of money around all over the place without a clue as to how it's really actually going to be paid for. And I think that's very, very dangerous. We don't have the kind of economy that is going to withstand somebody standing up and losing the confidence of the markets, as undoubtedly Nigel Farage, if he was Prime Minister to do, would do. And I think most economists would say that. Something we have got to communicate, therefore, and it goes back to this taking your time to do things, is a real conversation about the challenges that our country faces. We have a tax system where the tax burden is way too high, and it's going up to records ever since records began under this government. It's overcomplicated. Does it lean at every turn into growth, wealth creation, employment, etc., the kind of things you need to get growth going? No. So it's a huge piece of work to be done there. The size of government. We had 365,000 civil servants before the pandemic, 515,000 today. That speaks to the bloated nature of government. Huge bit of work to be done there. Skills. If we're going to bring down net migration, we're going to have to get much sharper on the skills front, or we're going to have areas of the labour market where there are critical shortages. I think we have to question with higher education, universities, whether everybody going through those institutions is getting enough value added to justify the investment they're making and we're making as a country in putting them through. And I think we have to focus much more on apprenticeships and skills, particularly for the reason of getting net migration down. Welfare. It's spiralling out of control. It is a huge project to start to get a £250 billion budget under control. It needs deep thought and analysis to find the answers to that, some of which we were doing when we were in government. Supply side, building houses. We know that the Migration Advisory Committee says that 300 homes a year, even if you built them, which is this government's target, would only be commensurate with a net migration figure of 170,000 if you take into account the natural growth in the size of the population. What that tells you is 300,000 is a long way from being enough. So a big, big thing about housing. Roads, rail. You cannot expand business and laboratory space around Cambridge at the moment, which is desperate for it. Why? Because you can't get the planning because there's not enough water. We haven't built a reservoir in this country for 30 years. How can we have a competitive economy if our energy costs are 4 or 5 times that of the United States and higher than France and Germany? And how can we be a thriving economy if the City of London is not firing on all cylinders? You look at the number of IPOs, the listings of new companies compared to New York. We're falling behind, and increasingly so. Huge bit of work to do there. And then we've got the issue of the age point that I made earlier. Too many young people feel very disengaged in a variety of ways, one of which is economically. We know they can't get on the housing ladder. We know that if they go to university, they get saddled up with a lot of debt. And if you look at the social attitudes of 16 to 24-year-olds, for example, too few of them would fight for king or country. Too few of them believe that democracy is the best system rather than autocracy in our country. And that speaks to disengagement. So we've got to also, on top of all those other problems we've got to solve, we've got to work out how we get a more popular, inclusive capitalism going, something of which we saw to a degree, at least in the 1980s. You look at the level of share ownership in our country compared to America. In the back of a yellow cab in New York, the taxi driver might say, what do you think of Apple? Why? Because people over there tend to own shares to a much greater degree than they do over here. We have to get young people onto the housing ladder. There are lots of things that we've got to do. Now, if we can get out there and have a conversation with the public that says cakeism is over, there is no in one bound Jack was free solution to suddenly transforming our economy overnight so it's growing gangbusters, and anybody who promises you that is a charlatan, because we've got all these deep-seated challenges, but we're going to do the thinking to come up with the solutions so that we get the answers. Then I think that's a more interesting and fruitful debate for us, compared to Farage, who is simply standing up and spouting all these things, all these goodies that everybody's apparently going to get without any thought behind it whatsoever.
Nigel Farage says that the two-party system is dead. You represent one of those parties. How do you respond to that, given that one poll has put you fourth yeah, behind the Liberal Democrats in voter intention if there were a general election tomorrow?
These polls will move around. We are undoubtedly into multi-party politics at the moment, so it's certainly true that there's been a general drift of voters away across the political spectrum rather than being more concentrated. I think the 24 election to a greater degree than at any time since the 1920s. So that is a cephalogical reality, but that doesn't mean that Nigel Farage wins in 4 years' time. He is as vulnerable to the volatility in politics as any of the other parties. Now, at the moment, he's able to stand on his stage and crow about it and say, oh, look at them, they're lagging and all the rest of it. He needs to worry about this too. People's views can change very quickly. And I mentioned Pierre Poilievre. They had a huge, you could say, you could have bet your house on him winning the Canadian election. He didn't. It all fell away.
Nigel Farage today said that Rachel Reeves is completely out of her depth. He said he's never seen someone so out of their depth before. Do you agree with him? And between Nigel Farage and Rachel Reeves, who do you think would be a more competent, trustworthy person to handle the nation's finances?
That second question is a very unfair question to make me, yeah, and then when I choose, you'll say, oh, yeah, I'll see everything. Look, I don't think I trust either of them, right, with the stewardship of our economy. I think what we've heard from Nigel Farage today is utter fantasy economics and very dangerous. What I expect to happen over the coming days, weeks and months is a lot of economists and commentators really get into the detail of this and pick it over and shine a light of truth onto what's actually happening. Rachel Reeves came into government with no plan. This is a fundamental problem. You think they've been out of office long enough to put one together. They said before the election, we will not be putting up taxes left, right and centre. They also said you can trust us on wind fuel payments and we won't tax farmers and all these kinds of things. And then promptly ran off and did complete the reverse. So by slapping those taxes on businesses, they completely stifled growth. They also stoked inflation because the NIC's rises, of course, partly gets passed on by way of higher prices. They went out and borrowed a massive amount of money and spent a huge amount of money, which stoked inflation, which meant that interest rates were therefore held higher for longer. That in turn meant that the serving cost on that ever-increasing debt that they're piling up on top of the debt that was there before means the servicing cost is about $100 billion a year, or twice what we spend on defence. And she blew her headroom from the autumn budget. She repaired it in the spring. It looks like it's all gone again and probably more. And that does not speak to a very successful stewardship of our economy, I'm afraid.
Well dodged, I think there, Cleo. Very good question. Mel Stride, thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea.
A great pleasure. Nice to be here.